Does closing the stack on your offset smoker result in juicier meat? I noticed that the air coming out of my stack is a lot more humid when the stack is closed, so I thought, I wonder if that's helping my barbecue retain more moisture. We're gonna find out in this video, so let's get smoking. Welcome to the Smoke Lab. My name is Steve Gao, and on this show, I do crazy barbecue experiments you would never do at home, so you can learn from my trial and error. The exhaust stack, what does it do? Well, it's generally understood that the stack affects the airflow or draw on the smoker. If you open the exhaust damper or physically increase the diameter or length of the stack, more air will flow through the firebox, through the smoker, and through the stack due to the fact that hot air rises and goes to the path of least resistance, and also due to something called the stack effect. In practical terms, what that means is when you close your exhaust damper down, it slows down the airflow of your fire, so you get lower temperatures in the cook chamber. Unfortunately, it also backs up and increases the concentration of smoke in the cook chamber, so you get smokier meat. Often a little bit too smoky. So personally, and this is the way that I do it now, it could change next week if I find a better way, I like to leave the exhaust damper wide open, and I control my temperatures by adding small splits of wood more frequently, and also by opening and closing the firebox door, which has a larger impact and a much more immediate impact on temperature control. But one day I tried closing my exhaust damper down a bit, and I noticed that the exhaust air felt more humid on my hand. It's really dry where I live in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and I'm always looking for ways to add more humidity into my smoker. So it got me thinking, maybe I'm missing out on something here. Maybe I could get more humidity in my smoker and juicier barbecue simply by closing my exhaust stack. To test it out, I'm smoking some pork tenderloins. I chose these for this experiment because we're measuring moisture loss, and tenderloins are better for that because they're leaner and they're more consistent in their makeup of muscle fibers, fat, and connective tissue than something like a pork butt or brisket, which is really inconsistent from one brisket or pork butt to another, and often they have very different amounts of fat and collagen and muscle fibers. I'm seasoning them with Oklahoma Joe's Nashville hot rub and letting them sit on the counter for a few minutes while I head outside to set up the smoker. I'm using my Longhorn offset smoker for this experiment. First, I need to set up my wet bulb thermometer to measure the humidity in the cook chamber, so I'm filling a steel pan with ice water. Then I'm foiling the pan, slicing a slot into it, and placing a sponge into it. Now I'm inserting a wired probe into the sponge. The sponge is going to wick moisture up and constantly evaporate as hot air flows over it. So the probe will be measuring the temperature at which water evaporates in the cook chamber, also known as the wet bulb temperature. Basically, if there's more water in the air, it takes a higher temperature for water to evaporate. So if our wet bulb thermometer, which remember is measuring the temperature at which water is evaporating in the cook chamber, is higher, that tells us that the humidity is higher, and if it's lower, that tells us that it's much drier in the smoker. I'm also setting up an ambient probe next to the sponge. This will tell us our ambient air temperature, also known as the dry bulb temperature. My hypothesis for this experiment is that by closing the stack, we will get a higher wet bulb temperature, which in turn will cause the meat to retain more moisture because less moisture evaporates at higher wet bulb temperatures. Now I'm adding some Oklahoma Joe's briquettes to the firebox and lighting them. I'm using mainly briquettes for this experiment because they produce less smoke and more consistent heat, which I think will help me get much more accurate results. I'm now adding a small split of cherry wood every hour or so, just so we get some smoke in the cook chamber. And now I'm placing 2 loins on the smoker and inserting a probe into each one. I'll take one up to 145 degrees internal and another one up to 165 degrees internal, and I'll measure the weight loss of each one. For this first test, I'm leaving the stack wide open, and I'm just controlling temperatures at 225 degrees Fahrenheit using the firebox door. At 225 degrees Fahrenheit, you can see that the wet bulb temperature was hovering around 120 degrees, and the smoke coming out of the stack looked like this, really clean and barely visible. The outside temperature was 70 degrees Fahrenheit at 20% humidity, which is really, really dry, so that's mainly why the wet bulb temperature is so low at just 120 degrees as a baseline. If you're cooking somewhere that's much more humid, like in Texas or in Florida, you will get a higher wet bulb temperature and you will actually get juicier meat, which is why I'm so jealous of people that get to smoke meat there, and I'm obsessed with making my smokers more humid up where I live in a drier climate. 2 hours later, the one tenderloin is at 145 degrees internal, so I removed it from the smoker. I weighed it at 13% moisture loss, then I sauced it with some Blues Hog Tennessee see red. I sliced into it and this is how it looked. Super juicy. That is exactly how I like my pork loins. 145 degrees always gives me the best results. Hours later, the 165 degree tenderloin took almost 6 hours to reach 165 degrees. So at that point, I removed it from the smoker. I weighed it at 28% moisture loss, and you can see how much less juicy it is than the 145 loin, which is why I always take my loins just to 145 degrees. They always turn out better. For the second test, I did everything exactly the same. The only difference is the stack was closed about 2/3 of the way down. Here's what the smoke looked like. It's more humid, but it's also a lot smokier, and you can see smoke escaping from other unsealed areas from the bottom of the smoker because the smoke is backed up in the cook chamber and looking for ways to escape. The 145 degree loin took around 2 hours, which is the same cook time as the open stack 145 degree loin, and it only lost 11% of its weight, so a bit more moisture retention than the open stack 145 degree loin. The 165 degree loin with the closed stack took only 3 hours to reach 165 degrees compared to almost 6 hours for the open stack test, and it weighed in at 18% moisture loss, which was much less than the 28% moisture loss in the open stack test. So interesting results with the 145 degree loins in both tests, whether the stack was wide open or closed 2/3 of the way. They took approximately the same amount of time to cook, and they retained almost exactly the same amount of moisture with a slight edge to the closed stack 145 degree loin. But where we really saw the difference was with the 165 degree loin. With the closed stack, it cooked a lot faster, almost twice as fast, and it retained a lot more moisture than the open stack 165 degree loin. Why is this the case? Well, if we look at the wet bulb temperature in each test, we get 120 with the open stack and 126 on average with the closed stack. This suggests that yes, the test with the closed stack actually resulted in a higher wet bulb temperature and there was more humidity in the cook chamber. So that seems to support my hypothesis that closing the stack results in a higher wet bulb temperature, which in turn results in juicier meat, but there could be other reasons as well. Another reason that the closed stack loins were juicier could just be because they simply cooked faster and there was less time for evaporative cooling for the meat to dry out. But I also noticed that the temperature in the cook chamber below the grates was slightly higher by about 6 degrees when the stack was fully closed as compared to when it was fully open. It was 6 degrees less when it was open. I think this is because when the stack is fully open 100%, you're getting a lot of airflow through the firebox, through the cook chamber, and it's sort of going up and over top of the meat and out. All those convection currents are concentrated in the top of the cook chamber. But when you close the stack down a little bit, let's say 2/3 of the way down, then it kind of pushes the convection currents down a little bit. Let's say it goes like this. And all of that smoke backs up in the cook chamber, which I think evens out the temperatures up and down vertically in the cook chamber. So you get higher temperatures lower underneath the meat and more even temperatures above. So that could be the reason why the closed stack tenderloins turned out more juicy. It might have been because the temperatures were more even in the cook chamber. There was more heat underneath and all around the meat. It cooked faster, therefore there was less evaporative cooling, and that's why we got juicier results. And also another thing that I noticed that was really interesting is that I got a baseline of, let's say, 120 degrees wet bulb temperature during the open stack test, but whenever I added a split, it spiked in wet bulb temperature as soon as I added that split, and it maintained a new baseline a couple degrees higher until that split burned out, and then it dropped back down to 120 degrees, back to its original baseline, which suggests that the moisture in the wood actually contributes a lot to the wet bulb temperature. And that's something that would be interesting to explore for a future experiment. As for smoke flavor, the closed stack tenderloins were much smokier than the open stack tenderloins. A little bit too smoky for my tastes, actually, and that was not unexpected. I knew that was gonna happen because you get more smoke when you close off the stack, but it's something that's interesting to note. In conclusion, this experiment supports the hypothesis that yes, closing your stack down does result in juicier barbecue. As for the reason why, that is still a little bit unclear to me. It could be because closing the stack raises the wet bulb temperature and humidity in the cook chamber, which results in the meat cooking faster and retaining more moisture because there's less evaporative cooling. But it also could be because closing down the stack backs up the convection currents and the smoke into the cook chamber. It evens out the temperatures up and down, so there's more even temperatures surrounding the meat, which causes it to cook faster. which means that there's less evaporative cooling over time. So what's some practical advice that I could give based on this experiment? Well, I would say for bigger cuts of meat like pork butt and brisket that can really take a lot more smoke, it might be a good idea to close your stack down, and that might result in juicier meat and faster cook times. But you do get a lot more smoke in the cook chamber and a lot more smoky flavor on your meat from closing the stack down. So for more delicate cuts of meat like chicken and fish, I might just leave my stack wide open because those tend to cook pretty fast anyway. Personally, what I'm gonna do going forward is I'll probably close my stack down a little bit more as long as I'm getting clean smoke and a clean burning fire. Let me know if you have any ideas for future smoke lab experiments that you'd like to see. Don't forget to subscribe to the Oklahoma Joe's YouTube channel, and until next time, happy smoking.